Welcome to Hearts on Trail, a Western romance novel. Written by Letha Watson. Narrated by Karen Thomas. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No reproduction in any form without written permission from the publisher. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. Falls Settlement no longer exists on the official map of the state of Montana. Well, at least not the Falls Settlement that nestled in a hollow on the plains beneath the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. It's interesting how these small places manage to disappear from the map over time. There's no doubt that they do, and they are completely forgotten, except maybe by those who actually lived or visited there. It's the same with all developing countries, and around 20 to 30 years ago, Montana was definitely a new country. It was around 1885 when Falls Settlement reached its peak prosperity, which was based on supplying dry goods and machinery to a widely scattered and sparse population of small ranchers and farmers. These things brought it into existence and kept it going for a few years. Then it gradually faded away, just like these kinds of places tend to do. When Thomas Milligan rode into Falls, he wondered what kind of rural haven he had stumbled upon. Of course, he didn't wonder in those exact words. His language was much more derogatory towards the place. It was late in the afternoon when his horse gently trotted onto the grassy area that served as Falls Marketplace. He stopped and looked around, hoping to find someone who could give him some information. The place was completely deserted. It was scorching hot, and the people of Falls didn't usually venture out much on such days, unless they had urgent matters to attend to. Since there were only 2 seasons in the year when such a thing was likely to happen, and this wasn't one of them, no one was out and about. The sky was clear, without a single cloud in sight. Milligan was tired, stiff, and incredibly thirsty, as he wasn't accustomed to spending long hours in the saddle. He had grown weary of the monotonous ride across the endless prairies of the West. Now he found himself surrounded by a circle of uncertain wooden houses. None of them suggested luxury, but after the rolling grasslands, they offered companionship and life. And right now, that's all the horseman cared about. He examined each house, looking for a single human face. Finally, he spotted a window filled with curious faces on the other side of the circle. It was enough. Patting his tired horse's flanks, he rode towards it. More signs of life emerged as a small man cautiously appeared from around the corner of a building, staring at him. The stranger was an interesting character. His face was as tanned as a prairie trail and just as weathered. His long hair and flowing beard resembled matured hay. His attire matched his face: worn and dirty moleskin trousers, a blue shirt, a shabby black jacket, and a vibrant bandana around his neck, with a battered prairie hat resting on the back of his head. Milligan halted his horse in front of this welcoming sight and dismounted with some stiffness, while the little man examined his overall appearance. "Is this Falls Settlement?" the newcomer asked, smiling in a friendly manner. He was a masculine-looking man with black hair and piercing steel-blue eyes, dressed in a simple jacket and riding outfit. He wasn't particularly handsome, but had a strong, dependable face. The stranger nodded in agreement. He murmured. "Can you show me the way to the hotel?" The other man's gaze had finally settled on the magnificent pair of balloon-shaped corduroy riding pants that Milligan was wearing, which had now settled back into their natural, voluminous folds. He didn't audibly respond, captivated by the unfamiliar sight before him. A slight tilt of his head was the only indication he gave. Milligan glanced at the indicated house. He was unsure, and with good reason. The place was a simple 2-story shack, crooked and unimpressive. "Does the owner accept guests?" he inquired. "Ayala takes just about anyone," came the casual response. The hotel door swung open, and 2 men emerged, scrutinizing the newcomer and his horse. Then they casually leaned against the doorframe and chewed silently, seemingly unconcerned. Milligan took a chance and asked another question. He felt out of place in this company. It was his first encounter with a prairie settlement, and he wasn't sure what to expect. "I wonder if someone can attend to my horse," he said hesitantly. "Tie him to the post over there and ask inside," the uncommunicative man replied, pointing to a post a few yards from the door, but still keeping his interest fixed on Milligan's pants. "That seems reasonable." Milligan walked away and secured his horse, loosening the saddle straps. "Excuse me, sir," he said upon returning, his well-groomed 6-foot frame towering over the other's 5'4". "May I ask who I have the pleasure of speaking with?" "My name is Thomas Milligan. I'm on my way to Fly Bend, William Selby's ranch. As you can see, I am a stranger in these parts. I'm sure you've already noticed," he finished amiably. But the other man's attention remained fixated on the intriguing sight of the corduroys, and he answered without shifting his gaze. "My name is Ranks, but folks generally call me Whist. Howdy." "Well, Mr. Ranks, or should I say Whist," interrupted the other. "Mr. Whist, then," Milligan smiled. "Whist." The man's emphasis was clear. He wouldn't be denied his proper title. Whist was his nickname according to prairie customs. Ranks was merely a family name and held no significance. "Well, Whist," Milligan chuckled, "shall we go and sample Ayala's refreshments? I'm exhausted, and I'm really thirsty," he said, stepping towards the doorway and glancing back. Mr. Ranks had not moved, but his eyes followed the other man's movements with curiosity. "Won't you come with me?" Milligan asked. Then, noticing the intense stare in Mr. Ranks's eyes, he continued impatiently, "What on earth are you staring at?" And in self-defense, he couldn't help but examine his own pants. Whist looked up, a twinkle of amusement shining beneath his thick eyebrows, and a wide grin spreading across his face. "Oh, just nothing," he said amiably. "I was just trying to figure out who those pants of yours were made for." He spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Then, shaking his head thoughtfully, the grin was replaced by a look of solemn wonder. "Say," he added, "but that guy must have been a really big man." Milligan was about to respond, but a glance at Mr. Ranks and an audible snicker from the doorway quickly changed his mind. He turned around to face a burst of laughter, and he understood. "The drinks are on me," he said, somewhat embarrassed. "Come on, everyone. Yes, I'm a newcomer." And it was his friendly reply that immediately earned him a place in the community of Falls Settlement. In just 5 minutes, his horse was taken care of and stabled. In just 5 minutes, he was addressing the people in the saloon by their nicknames. In just 5 minutes, he was paying a ridiculously high price for whiskey. In just 5 minutes, well, he took in his first taste of prairie customs and prairie ways. It is not necessary to deeply analyze the characters of the people in Falls. It is not good to dig into rotten soil. The process is always unpleasant. A brief summary is all that is needed. William Ayala sold alcohol. He was a small man with sharp, crafty eyes and a mouth that closed tightly under a neatly trimmed gray mustache. Chuck Pindle, the carpenter, was a sorrowful man who appeared as kind as a disguised wolf. His large, scarred face never smiled, because his friends said it was physically impossible for it to do so, and his enormous, rough body was as uncultured as his manners and as cumbersome as his slow-moving tongue. Taylor, also known as Twirly, the butcher, was a man so friendly and rosy-cheeked that within 5 minutes you started to wish that he had the physicality of animals that cannot audibly express their good humor, or, if they can, there is no need to acknowledge it except with a well-placed kick. And Whist, quiet, unsophisticated Whist, shadier than the shadiest of them all, but a man who took immense delight in the humor of life, and who did wrong out of an excessive enjoyment in outwitting his neighbors. A man to smile at, but to avoid. These were the men Thomas Milligan, fresh from Harvard and a generous home, found himself associated with while he rested on his way to Fly Bend. William Ayala made an effort to be pleasant. "Going to Fly Bend?" he remarked as he handed his new guest the change from a $100 bill. "Well, it's a tidy establishment. $95, sir. $1 per drink. You'll find that it's the best ranch in these parts. Say," he continued, "the old blind horse has organized it quite nicely. I'll give him that." "Blind mule," interjected Whist, leaping onto a bar stool. "Mule?" questioned Chuck with great disdain. "I reckon you haven't worked around his establishment, Whist. Skunk is what I think of him. I reckon his kicks are similar to a mule's, but there's nothing else to compare. A mule is a hard-working, respectable citizen, which can't be said about William Selby." Chuck swung his leg over the back of a chair and sat down with his arms folded across it and his heavy bearded chin resting on them. "But you can't expect a blind man to be the epitome of friendliness," said Milligan. "Think about his condition." "Listen here, young guy," interjected Chuck, thrusting his chin forward assertively. "Condition shouldn't be considered when a man keeps a big, bullying jerk of a foreman like Lonnie Harnack. Let me tell you, those two, the blind jerk and Lonnie, can cause chaos on that ranch in just 5 minutes, like a tribe of warriors on the warpath. I constructed a barn on that property last summer, and I definitely know." "That's reassuring for me," observed Milligan with a laugh. "Oh, you won't have to deal with his rough demeanor," added Ayala casually. "I guess you're paying a premium?" asked Chuck. "I'm going to receive 3 years of instruction." 3 years in Fly Bend?" said Whist calmly. "You'll definitely learn a lot in 3 years in Fly Bend." The little man chewed on the end of a cigar that Milligan had given him, while his twinkling eyes exchanged meaningful glances with his companions. Twirly laughed loudly and leaned against the bar, stretching out his arms on either side of him and gripping its molded edge with his large hands. "And you're paying for that instruction?" the butcher asked incredulously, once his laughter had subsided. "Seems like in this country you have to pay for everything you receive," Milligan replied, a bit curtly. He was being laughed at more than he appreciated. Nevertheless, he controlled his annoyance. He wanted to know about the local reputation of the rancher he had become an apprentice to, so he asked a direct question to his audience. "Listen up," he said sharply. "What's the deal? What's wrong with this William Selby?" He looked around for an answer, which for a few minutes didn't seem to be forthcoming. Whist finally broke the silence. "He's blind," he said quietly. "I already know that," retorted Milligan impatiently. "I want to know something else." He glanced at the butcher, who just laughed. He confronted the bar owner, who shook his head. Finally, he turned to Chuck. "Well," the carpenter began with a serious air of considering his words, "I'm not the type to judge someone right away. I suppose I know something about the blind man of Fly Bend, seeing as I was working on a contract for him all last summer. And what I know is unpleasant. I've witnessed things on that ranch that have made me tightly grip my axe, and it took a lot of effort to restrain myself from hitting a few heads. I've seen that arrogant Lonnie Harnack, the foreman, brutally beating some of the workers while the blind man just stood there as if he could see what was happening, and I've observed his satisfaction with every blow as Lonnie struck, simply because it pleased him. I've seen some of those men degrade themselves and grovel at their master's feet. I've seen that group of animal-loving thugs mistreat their horses and cattle, treating them as if they were already dead. I've witnessed pure chaos on that ranch. And why, you may ask, do their cowboys and workers endure it? Because, I quickly reply, there are no other jobs available in this area once William Selby is through with them. That's why. "Where were you working before?" asks a foreman. "Fly Bend," says the cowboy. "Well, we have nothing for you," the foreman quickly responds. "I guess this isn't a butchering business." And that's exactly how it is throughout Fly Bend, Chuck concluded, spitting expertly into the spittoon at the bar. "Absolutely right," Twirly chimed in with a laugh. "Perhaps you're a bit biased," suggested Ayala, keeping an eye on his visitor. "Chuck's been reading books lately," Whist added softly. "I suppose dime novels have a strong hold on some people." "Call them dime novels yourself," Chuck retorted sullenly. "Perhaps young Dave Steele has returned from there with a bullet in his head that left him completely insane ever since until he died because of some altercation he had with Lonnie, maybe something out of a cheap novel. Hey, get right to it, and keep pouring whiskey, Whist ranks. You can do that and not tell me about the blind man." A pause in the conversation followed while William dried some glasses. The room was getting dark. It was a gloomy den. Milligan was thoughtfully smoking. He was digesting and sifting through what he had heard, trying to separate fact from fiction in Chuck's story. He felt that there must be some exaggeration. At last he broke the silence, and all eyes were turned on him. "And do you mean to say there is no law to protect people on these remote stations? Do you mean to tell me that men sit down quietly under such despicable tyranny?" His questions were more specifically directed towards Chuck. "Law?" replied the carpenter. "Law? Say, we don't recognize any law around these parts, not yet." Maybe it's coming, but I believe there's just one law at present, and that we mostly carry on us. Oh, Lonnie Harnack has met his match before now, but it's not frequent. Yes, Lonnie's a big jerk, with the strength of 2 men, but I've seen him get defeated, and not 100 miles from where we're sitting. Say, William, he turned to the man behind the bar, you're not likely to forget the night Black Anton revealed his true abilities. There's no bluff with Anton. When he gets to the business end of a gun, it's best to raise your hands quickly. The saloon keeper nodded. Guess there's one man who has Lonnie's measure, and that's Black Anton. The butcher added a confirming laugh, while Whist nodded. And who is Black Anton? Asked Milligan of the saloon keeper. Anton? Well, I guess he's Selby's personal horsekeeper. He's a half-breed, French-Canadian, and tough. Say, he's just as quiet and easy you wouldn't know he was around. Soft-spoken as a woman, and just about as vicious as a rattlesnake. Guess you'll meet him. And I know he's approachable until he's angered. Pleasant sort of man if he can intimidate this wonderful Lonnie, observed Milligan calmly. Oh, yes, pleasant enough, said William, misunderstanding his guest's meaning. The only thing I can't understand about Anton, said Whist, suddenly becoming interested, is that he's earning his living honestly. He's too quiet and sly. He sort of sneaked into this territory without any damn citizen of us knowing. We've heard stories of him since from across the border, and the stories aren't nice. I don't intend to argue with strangers at any time, and when Anton's around I never give my opinion until he's done talking, when I mostly find mine's the same as his. Some folks don't have any courage, growled Chuck contemptuously. And some folks have so much courage they don't have any room for understanding, interrupted Whist sharply. Meaning me, said Chuck, sitting up angrily. I acknowledge you've got courage, replied the little man calmly, looking directly into the big man's eyes. Go to hell. Guess I'd rather be in Falls. It's warmer, replied Whist calmly. Shut up. You complain like a widow who can't find a second husband. Which wouldn't happen with people of your kind around. Chuck was on his feet in an instant, and his anger was blazing in his fierce eyes. Say, you jerk! Sit right there, Chuck, interrupted Whist, as the big man lunged toward him. Sit right there. There won't be any horseplay. Whist Ranks had not moved from his position, but his right hand had reached into his jacket pocket, and his eyes flashed ominously. And the carpenter dropped back into his seat without a word, and Milligan looked on in astonishment. It was all so quick, so sudden. There had barely been a moment to catch their breath between the passing of their good nature and their quick-rising anger. The strangeness of it all, the lawlessness, intrigued him. He knew he was on the outskirts of civilization, but he had no idea how sparse and brief that outskirts were. He thought that civilization relied on the presence of white people. That, inevitably, white people must possess the instincts of civilization. Here he saw men, seemingly good friends, who were ready, at the slightest provocation, to turn and attack each other. It was definitely a new experience for him, something that he may have vaguely dreamt of, but never seriously considered the possibility of its existence. However, strangely enough, as he witnessed these things for himself for the first time, they didn't shock him, they didn't bother him in any way. It all seemed so natural. Moreover, it stirred in him a sense that such things should exist. Perhaps this feeling was a result of his own upbringing, which had been that of a fundamentally athletic university. He even felt the warm blood rush through his veins at the thought of a forceful end to the 2 men's quick fight. But the excitement quickly faded away. Whist slipped from the bar to the ground, and his deep-set eyes were once again smiling. "Oh, well," he said with a casual shrug, "there's nothing to be concerned about." Chuck stood up and stretched as if nothing had happened to disrupt the harmony of the gathering. The butcher let go of the bar and walked over to the window. "I suppose the wife will be calling for you guys to come and get your dinners," Whist remarked cheerfully. Then he turned to Milligan. "William here doesn't take in any boarders. Maybe you should go over to my place. Chelsea will provide you with a blanket or 2, and the food isn't bad. You see, I operate a boarding house for the guys, or rather, Chelsea does." And Milligan accepted the suggestion. He had no other option but to comply. In any case, he was completely satisfied with the arrangement. He had entered the prairie lifestyle and was more than willing to embrace its customs and its people, and the memory of that first night in Falls stayed with him even when the recollection of many subsequent nights had faded. It clung to him like only the initial strong impressions of a new life can. He encountered Chelsea Ranks, who was too big for the dining room of the boarding house and spoke in a sharply nasal manner that sliced through the air like a knife. She piled the plates with coarse food that required a hearty appetite to face. For the first time in his life, he dined at a table without a tablecloth and consumed his food using a knife and fork that had never been polished since they first arrived. He drank boiled tea from a tin cup that had once been enameled. He was no longer Thomas Milligan, fresh from the New England states, but one of 14 boarders, most of whom elongated their sentences by using an extensive vocabulary of profanity and cleaned their teeth with their pocket knives. But he found it enjoyable. He was surrounded by a semblance of naturalness. Maybe they were drawn from the lowest rungs of society, but they had proven their right to exist, something that distinguished them from the masses of law-abiding citizens. He felt a sense of camaraderie with these ruffians. Moreover, he held a certain admiration for them. After dinner, many of them returned to their hangout, the bar. Milligan, although he had no desire to drink, would have done the same. He wanted to interact more with the locals, observing them as someone who wants to familiarize themselves with a new role. However, the calm Whist pulled him back and spoke to him gently, and he listened. "Hey, Milligan," the small man casually mentioned. "There are 3 guys looking for a game. 2 of them aren't very skilled at drawing cards, but the other one is pretty good. I thought maybe you'd like to join us. It's better than hanging around at the saloon. We usually play with a $1 limit." And so it was decided. Milligan stayed. He was initiated. He learned the outcome of a game of draw in Falls, where the players turned life into a gamble, and he became quite skilled in the art. The outcome was inevitable. By midnight there were 4 wealthier individuals in Falls and a newcomer who had lost some of his $100 bill. But Milligan took his loss in good spirits. He never truly understood why he lost, whether it was because of his poor playing or simply bad luck. He was already tired and sleepy long before the game ended. The next morning, when he contemplated on the events, he realized that he had been deceived in some mysterious way. Nonetheless, he took his initiation philosophically, only making a mental note for future reference. That night, he slept on a makeshift bed of straw, using a thin bolster as a pillow, propped against his outer garments. 3 faded yellow blankets provided some comfort, and the entire arrangement was spread out on the floor of a room where 4 other men were sleeping noisily. After breakfast, he settled his bill and got his horse ready for departure. His first acquaintance in Falls remained a loyal friend until the end. While it was Whist who checked his horse's equipment to ensure the saddle was secure, Whist was also the one to commend the animal in a discerning manner. Whist was the individual who shook his hand and wished him luck, along with offering a parting piece of advice. Just as it was Whist who initially ridiculed him, took care of him for a fee during his stay, and discreetly cheated him in a game he knew little about. With the mindset of a determined individual who possesses the qualities necessary for success, Milligan smiled, shook hands warmly and sincerely, and quietly absorbed the knowledge he gained during his first night in Falls Settlement. "Hey, Milligan," Whist exclaimed in a friendly manner as he fervently grasped his departing guest's hand. "I'm really glad I've met you. I reckon, considering how you arrived, you might have stumbled upon some despicable person who lacked the courtesy to deal with a fool. There's an abundance of them in Falls. Take care. By the way, there's a fantastic girl at Fly Bend. She's the old blind boss's daughter, and she's exceptional, but don't court her when the old man is present." Milligan chuckled. Whist entertained him. "Goodbye," he replied. "Your generosity has alleviated my concerns. I am now more knowledgeable than I was yesterday morning. No, I won't pursue the girl while her father is around. I hope to see you again sometime." And he departed from Falls. "That fellow is not only decent, but he's a gentleman," Whist muttered, gazing after the retreating horseman. "I believe Fly Bend is the perfect place for him. He'll excel like a buoy in a barrel of water. By the way, Lonnie Harnack will face consequences, or I don't comprehend a 2-spot from a straight flush." This sentiment conveyed his high regard for the man who had just left him. Chapter 2. The Cascades faded into a shimmering blur of heat as Milligan journeyed out across the rugged prairie path. They had told him it was a 10-mile journey to Flybend, an extension of the rolling plains he had become accustomed to. He let his horse take its time, as there was no rush to arrive early. Thomas Milligan, like many ambitious young individuals from New England, had taken a similar path. At the age of 25, after completing his studies at Harvard University, he found himself well-trained in various sports, particularly boxing and wrestling, as well as other self-defense games. However, he lacked the necessary skills to make a sufficient living. Therefore, he made the decision to venture into the prairie lands of the West to create a new path for himself. His goal was to raise livestock, and in order to achieve this, he searched for a ranch where he could gain thorough expertise before starting his own venture. Through official channels, he learned of Flybend, which was known as one of the largest ranches in the country at that time. He immediately began negotiations with the owner, William Selby, for a period of training. His current journey was the outcome of those discussions. As his horse ambled over the 10 miles, he pondered deeply. He carefully considered the stories he had heard from Chuck, examining them thoroughly. Eventually, he drew a few clear conclusions. Flybend was undeniably a rough place. The brutality witnessed there was likely a result of a clash between brute forces, taking into account the well-known nature of Western cowboys. Unfortunately, it seemed to be a necessary evil for maintaining order on the ranch. Chuck had somehow managed to anger the ranch owner and foreman, allowing personal feelings to cloud his judgment. Lastly, considering his own lack of experience, he realized that the agony he had endured was likely a product of the seasoned veteran's enjoyment in scaring newcomers. Milligan was not a weak person, or else he would not have embarked on forging his own path as he was currently doing. He was a man with a clear purpose, independent and rational, with enough affability to coexist with strength. He also appreciated his own experiences, without ever belittling the experiences of others. Wist had assessed him astutely when he remarked, "He'll come out on top like a cork in a barrel," but he had not fully recognized his true capabilities. The southwestern trail inclined towards the mountains, which formed a snowy barrier limiting his view to the west throughout his journey. He had observed the distant snow-capped fortifications until their novelty had faded, and now he regarded their presence as commonplace. His attention returned to the vast, seemingly boundless plains surrounding him, and he yearned for the sight of a tree, a river, or even a cultivated field of swaying wheat. However, there was nothing but the sparse, yellowish grass stretching for miles and miles, and the scorching sunlight that caused beads of dusty sweat to streak across his horse's shoulders and sides. He rode on, lost in reverie, as countless others have certainly done before and since. There was nothing innovative or original about his daydreams, as he was not inclined towards romantic notions. He was too straightforward and pragmatic for that. No, his thoughts were simply those of a young man who had left his home, which, with distance, gained a heightened beauty and was embellished in his fond memories with a splendor it could never possess in reality. Without any indication or warning, he stumbled upon one of those mysteriously concealed valleys abundant in the prairies near the Rockies. He found himself at its edge, peering down at a broad river, enclosed by woodlands, that meandered east and west like the trail of some ancient creature. The whisper of the flowing waters reached him with such an impression of coolness and shade that for the first time on his long journey from Whitewater, he was made to forget the park-like beauties of his own homeland. There was a delightful array of colors in the foliage down there, such a density of shadow, such brilliance, and a refreshing breeze was rustling over the treetops, a breath he had longed for on the plains but had never experienced. The opposite side was lower. He stood on a sort of massive step, a barrier that divided the land beyond from the land he was leaving, a barrier that seemed to isolate those who might reside down there and exclude them as if theirs was a separate world. He touched his horse's sides, and with careful, awkward steps, the animal began the descent. And now he wondered about the location of the ranch, for he knew that this was the Fly River, and somewhere along its banks stood his future home. As he thought about this, he chuckled. his future home. Well, based on what he had been told, it would certainly possess the allure of novelty. He was compelled to pause his speculation for a while. The trail descended so steeply that his horse had to move sideways down it, and the loose gravel under its hooves caused it to slide and slip dangerously. In 15 minutes, he halted on the riverbank and surveyed his surroundings. Where to? That was the question. He was at a crossroads. To the east and west along the riverbank, and to the north and south, the path he had traveled, and across the water. Along the bank, the woods were dense and dark, and the trail split them like the aisle of an old Gothic church. The surface of red sand was firm, but there were signs of activity on it. Then he gazed across the river at the distant rolling plains. "Of course," he said aloud. "Who's going to build a ranch on this side? Where can the cattle roam?" And he urged his horse towards the water and crossed without hesitation. Past the river, the road sharply veered to the right, cutting through a wide path of massive pine trees. He hurried his horse along this route. Half a mile ahead, the path widened. The somber depths surrounding him began to brighten, and rays of sunlight pierced through, illuminating the carpet of decaying pine cones and needles that covered the ground. The road curved abruptly away from the river, revealing a cluster of low bushes adorned with a collection of white garments, evidently hung out to dry. His horse startled at the unusual sight, and was further disturbed by the cacophonous sound of a man's voice singing a melancholy tune somewhere near the river to his right. In that direction, he noticed a path for cattle. The sight of it prompted him to investigate the identity of the mournful minstrel. Undoubtedly, this man could provide him with the information he sought. He veered off the road and plunged into the bushes. Along the riverbank, he stumbled upon a peculiar scene. There was an opening in the bushes, and the bank gently sloped towards the water. 3 or 4 washtubs, arranged in a semicircle, stood on wooden stands, and a uniquely odd-looking man hunched over one of them, washing clothes. He vigorously scrubbed and beat a handful of garments against a board, much like a washerwoman. His back was turned to the path, facing the river. To his right, an iron furnace and boiler emitted steam from under the lid. The surrounding bushes were adorned with drying clothes. "Hey there!" exclaimed Milligan as he dismounted. "Wow!" The scrubbing and banging ceased, and Milligan beheld the most remarkably contorted face he had ever encountered, as the man glanced back over his bowed shoulder. A flushed, sweaty face, adorned with a cluster of gray whiskers at the bottom of the chin, a pair of sharp gray eyes, and most notably, the mouth. That's what caught Milligan's attention. It curved up on one side, blending in with his cheek, and a dark red scar extended all the way up to his left eye. Milligan couldn't help but be amazed and tempted to laugh for a moment. Meanwhile, the gray eyes scrutinized him from head to toe, and then the stranger let out another even more astounded exclamation. "Wow!" And just like that, Milligan regained his composure. "Where's Fly Bend Ranch?" he inquired. The little man paused his laundry, turning around and leaning against the edge of the tub. "Fly Bend Ranch?" he repeated slowly, as if the question hadn't quite registered in his mind. Then he whispered under his breath, "Wow, but and looked down at his own clothes, as if seeking reassurance. Milligan interrupted, understanding the direction of the other man's thoughts. "Yes, Fly Bend," he said sharply. "It's about a mile away. Stay on the trail, and you'll reach Blind Hell in a few minutes. Say." He paused and met Milligan's gaze. "Yes, I'm heading there. Do you happen to belong to Blind Hell?" "Indeed I do," confirmed the washerman. "I do the chores around the ranch. Joe Nelson used to be a cattle farmer myself, Kerrville, Texas. But now," he trailed off, gesturing towards the drying clothes. "Well, I'm Thomas Milligan, and I'm on my way to Fly Bend." "So you're the newcomer," observed the choreman thoughtfully. "You're the guy from New England who Lonnie's going to whip into shape." "You mean teach," corrected the other. "I suppose I do," murmured the choreman gently, though without much conviction. The twisted side of his face contorted hideously, while the other side sported a smile. "You mentioned Blind Hell just now?" asked Milligan, as the other returned to silently observing him. "Blind Hell, did I?" said Nelson, repeating the name, a habit he seemed to have. "Yes. What is it? What did you mean?" Milligan's questions were a little demanding. He felt that the riding pants that had caused such attention in Falls were likely to invite further mockery. "Oh, it's just a name. It's not important. Say," the worker suddenly burst out, "you don't plan on herding cattle in those pants, do you?" He extended an unusually long arm and pointed a rough but remarkably clean finger at the flowing corduroys Milligan was now sensitive about. "Goodness, man!" he exclaimed irritably. "Have you never seen riding pants before? And you, a rancher!" The bearded man's tufted beard jerked to the side again as his face contorted, half of it smiling. "I suppose I have seen such things before. Once," he drawled slowly with a slight southern accent, but in a way that indicated a speech learned through association rather than it being his natural tongue. "He was a man who came out to hunt big game in the hills. I haven't seen him since then, for sure. I guess nobody did." He looked away sadly. "We heard about him. I reckon he went searching for bears. The wind was blowing terribly. He had climbed a mountain. It was quite high. There was no shelter. A gust of wind came and took him." Nelson had turned back to his tubs, once again banging and scrubbing. "A mile down the trail, you said?" Milligan exclaimed, quickly jumping into the saddle. "Indeed." And for the first time, Milligan's horse felt the sharp prick of the spurs as they rode off. Flybend Ranch stood in a wide clearing, with the house situated on a rising ground above it. It was bordered at the back by a dense pine forest. For the remainder, the house faced the prairie, and the front porch overlooked the barns, pens, and other buildings. It stood apart, about 100 yards from the nearest structures. This was the initial impression Milligan got upon arrival. The second was that it was an impressive ranch and the owner must be wealthy. The third was a feeling of disappointment. Everything was so quiet, so calm. There was no rush or commotion, no horsemen riding around with cracking whips, no shouting, no sense of wildness. And most disappointing of all, there were no herds of cattle running about, just a few old dairy cows nearby, peacefully grazing away, and patiently waiting for milking time. These, along with a few dogs, a horse or two roaming in the pens, and a group of men loitering outside a low, thatched building, constituted the scene he first witnessed as he rode into the clearing. "And this is blind hell," he thought to himself as he arrived. "It contradicts its name. I've never seen a more peaceful, beautiful sight." And then his mind went back to Falls. That too had seemed so innocent. After all, he remembered, it was the people who determined the character of a place. So he rode straight to a small, empty pen, and dismounting, set his horse free, and placed his saddle and bridle in the shade of the walls. Then he approached the buildings where the men were gathered. They stared at him intently as he approached, much like they would stare at a strange creature, and he felt a bit uneasy as he remembered his encounter with Whist first, and then Joe Nelson. He had become self-conscious about his appearance, and a sense of defiance and retaliation stirred within him. But for some reason, the men paid little attention to him at that moment. One man was speaking, and the rest were listening with absorbed interest. They were cowboys, everyone. Cowboys like Milligan had heard of. Some were still wearing their fringed chaps, their waists belted with gun and ammunition. Some were in plain overalls and thin cotton shirts. All, except one, were tanned a dark, ruddy hue, unshaven, unkempt, but tough-looking and hardy. The pale-faced exception was a thin, sick-looking guy with deep hollows under his eyes and lips as pale as a corpse. He was the one talking, and his story required a great display of dramatic gestures. Milligan approached and joined the group. "I never asked to get put up there," he heard the sick man saying. "Never asked and didn't want. It was her doing, and I tell you guys right here she's just so sweet and good that it doesn't matter. I would have wasted away here with flies and the heat, and they wouldn't have cared. That clueless guy would have just laughed if I had given in, and Lonnie said we'll even the score one day for sure. Next time Red Mask or any other horse thief comes around, I'll help drive off the gang. I'm not fighting for the blind man anymore. Look at me. I guess I'm no more useful than that inexperienced person over there." The speaker pointed scornfully at Milligan, and his audience turned and looked. "Guess I've lost lots of blood and have a hole in my chest that you couldn't plug with a burlap sack. And now, just when I'm starting to recover properly, he comes and kicks me out to the bunkhouse because he catches me chatting with his little girl. But let me tell you, she really let him have it in a way you guys have never heard. Yes, sir, I guess her words are usually smooth like velvet, but when she turned on that blind giant of a father of hers, well, if I were a cat and had 9 lives to give for her, they just wouldn't be enough by 100. "Hey, Arizona," said one of the men quietly. "What were you talking about? I assume you all were always infatuated with Miss Diane." Arizona confronted the speaker aggressively. "That will suffice for you, Raw. Maybe you don't understand, and don't recognize a lady when you see one. I'm a cowboy, and just as competent as any man here, and if you have any doubts about it, why—" "Don't pay any attention, Arizona," interjected a skinny young man hastily. He was a tall, gaunt-looking boy in that stage of physical development when nature seems uncertain about her original intention. "He's only teasing you." "Well, maybe Mr. Raw Harris can quit right here then, Teddy. I'm not accepting his disrespect in any way." "Get on with the story, Arizona," cried another. "Say, what were you saying to the girl?" "You see, Jacob," the sick man continued, reverting back to his slow manner of speaking. "It was like this. Miss Diane, she enjoys listening to a person's stories, and considering I've been traveling through most of the United States, she took an interest in my tales, which I think is reasonable. She had nursed me back to health, and had taken good care of me, and sat right beside me for a chat. You know how she is, a bit melancholic and tender-hearted. Well, she mentioned to me how she would like to visit Whitewater next winter and talked about dances and such. Let me tell you, she was absolutely thrilled at the thought of it. I believe she would be extremely delighted to get away. Now, I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but I started talking about a barbecue that took place down in Arizona. I was explaining how I was there and got injured slightly. It wasn't anything serious. You see, I was telling her that during my time running a small pig farm, we occasionally held parties. The particular gathering I was referring to was quite lively. The boys got very drunk, and they started shooting their guns before daybreak. Hey, it was the cause of the trouble I was talking about. You see, Brown was one of those guys who chewed tobacco until you could smell Virginia every time you got close to him. He was a grumpy guy, and he talked too much. You see, he had a lady with him. Well, she was the bartender from the saloon he liked, and he thought she was as beautiful as a magazine illustration. Well, when the alcohol was flowing freely, they started competing for the prettiest woman in the room, as is the custom down there. Brown was determined for his girl to win, I suppose, and Dyke Hole Bill had a pretty good-looking girl with him, too, and he didn't think a girl from a low-class saloon could outshine her. Well, to make it short, I guess the boys all voted for Bill's girl. They decided that there was no girl in Spawn City who could match her beauty. I think things got quiet when Shaggy Steele read the votes. The atmosphere in that place got tense. I quickly found the exit. You see, Brown was always impulsive, but the trouble came differently. The situation just escalated, and that crowd got rowdy for a while. Brown's girl stepped up and said, "Listen, I'm the best in this competition, and I won't sit around while some girl from Dyke Hole takes the prize. She's going to regret challenging me. You boys won't have any trouble figuring out who the winner is when I'm done." With that, she took off her top, and I must say, she was an attractive woman. And the girl from Dyke Hole wasn't any less impressive. I think she was bursting with excitement for a fight. But Brown inserts himself and starts talking nonsense. And that's about as far as I got when along comes that arrogant guy and points a warning finger at me while he stares at me with his bloodshot eyes. And he says, "You need to leave immediately, Arizona. The place for scum like you is in the bunkhouse, and I won't tolerate any sneaking around here telling disreputable stories to my girl." I was just about to argue, but he interrupts me with a curse. "Get out of here," he yells. "You have 10 minutes to leave." Then Miss Diane, bless her heart, she quickly turns on him and tells him off. She says, "Father, how can you be so unkind after everything Arizona has done for you? Remember," she says, "he saved you 100 head of cattle and fought Red Mask's gang until help arrived and he fell off his horse. Oh, she was great, and she really laid it on thick. She cried a lot, but it didn't matter. I had to leave, and I did. And now I bet that jerk Lonnie will try to make me work, but I'll take him down for sure." One of the men, Lou Cawley, silently laughs and then adds a comment. Lou was a big guy, and people said he was the son of an English priest. But people say similar things about many troublemakers in the Northwest. He still spoke with his ancestors' accent. Old blind hunks knows something. With all due respect, Arizona has a way with people. But, he says, before the fiery Southerner can respond, if I'm not mistaken, here comes Lonnie to fulfill Arizona's prediction. Everyone turns to look as Lou nods in the direction of the house. A massive man, about 6'5", is quickly walking down the hill. Milligan, who had been listening to the story on the edge of the group, looks at the newcomer with amazement. He approached with a stride that showcased immense, monumental strength. He had never witnessed such a physique in his entire life. The supervisor was still a considerable distance away, and he could not catch a glimpse of his face, only a wide expanse of dark beard and whiskers. So this was the much-dreaded Lonnie Harnack, and he thought with no particular delight, his future boss. There was no further conversation. Lonnie Harnack glanced up and stopped. Then he signaled, and a loud cheer reached the waiting group. "Hey! Hey! You there! You with the pants!" A snicker spread amongst the gathering, and Milligan knew that he was the one being called for. He turned away to conceal his frustration, but was not given an opportunity to escape. "Hey! Send that guy with the pants over here!" bellowed the supervisor, and Milligan was compelled to comply against his will. And thus the two men, primarily responsible for recounting this tale of Flybend, crossed paths. The atmosphere of the encounter was hostile, a sentiment that, in the days to come, would transform into merciless animosity. The reason was not hard to find, nor could it have been any different. Lonnie viewed the world through eyes that distorted everything to suit his own brutal nature, while Milligan's genuine integrity was a result of his upbringing as a student in an American school. The latter observed a man before him who appeared to be around 35, a man of immense height, with a face that possessed attractive features, but marred by the severe downward slope of the dark eyebrows over a pair of tough, audacious eyes. The lower portion of his face was concealed by a beard so thick and black that it completely obscured the shape of his mouth and chin, leaving only the harsh tones of his voice as a clue to what lay hidden beneath. His attire was unremarkable, but consisted of typical cotton trousers, a thin shirt, a gray tweed jacket, and a silk handkerchief around his neck. He carried no weapons, not even the typical leather belt and sheath knife, and in this he was different from the way his countrymen handled disputes, where firearms were commonly used. Lonnie saw a man who was slightly shorter than him, but well-built, with broad shoulders that hinted at strength. However, it was the unwavering gaze of his steel-blue eyes that stood out the most. There was a straightforwardness in them that indicated he was not accustomed to being intimidated. As Lonnie stared into his eyes, he made a mental note that this newcomer needed to be humbled at the earliest opportunity. They did not exchange pleasantries or shake hands. Lonnie blurted out his greeting in an aggressive tone. "Hey, didn't you hear me calling?" he asked sharply. "I did," the New Englander replied calmly, meeting Lonnie's gaze without any trace of arrogance or submission. "Then why the hell didn't you come?" Lonnie retorted roughly. "I wasn't aware that you were calling me," the other man replied. "Not aware?" the other man shot back rudely. "I don't think there's anyone else around here with pants like yours. Now listen here, kid. You better understand that I'm the foreman of this place, and as far as the workers are concerned, I'm the boss. When I call, you better come quickly." The man loomed over Milligan, his hands aggressively tucked into his jacket pockets, and he emphasized his final words with a scowl. It was his demeanor that provoked Milligan. The words themselves could have been laughed off, but the attitude conveyed something more, and no man likes to be bullied. His anger surged, and though he held himself back, it was evident in the biting emphasis of his response. "When I'm one of the workers, yes," he said sharply. Lonnie stared. Then a curious smile crossed his face. "Ha!" he exclaimed, and Milligan continued with cold indifference. "And in the meantime, I might as well say that the main purpose of my visit is to see Mr. Selby, not his supervisor. That, I believe," he added, pointing to the building on the hill, "is his house." Without waiting for a response, he stepped aside and would have moved on. But Lonnie had turned around, and his hand landed heavily on Milligan's shoulder. "No, you don't, my fancy guy!" he cried angrily, his fingers painfully gripping the muscle under the jacket. Springing aside, and with one swift twist, Milligan freed himself and stood facing the giant with blazing eyes and tense muscles. "Touch me again, and there will be trouble," he said sharply, and there was an oddly furious tone in his speech. The supervisor stood speechless for a moment. Then his anger erupted. "I just told you," he shouted, reverting to his country accent as his rage took over, "that I run this place." "And I'm telling you," interrupted Milligan, equally angry, "that I have nothing to do with you or the ranch until I have seen your boss. And let me inform you that if there's any intimidation to be done, you can save it until I am one of the workers. You won't lack opportunities." The tone was as scathing as his anger allowed. He had not moved, except to put his right hand in his jacket pocket, while he observed the supervisor's every move. He saw Harnack tense as if to attack him. He saw the large hands clench at his sides and his arms draw up involuntarily. He saw the intense expression on his face and his narrowed eyes as they almost closed beneath the overhanging brows. Then the rough, anger-filled voice came. "By God! I'll destroy you, you—" "I shouldn't say it." Milligan's tone suddenly changed to one of icy coldness. The sight of a white dress had caught his attention. "There's a lady present," he added abruptly, and at the same time he let go of the smooth handle of a heavy pistol he had been clutching in his pocket. It would be impossible to say what might have happened if not for the timely interruption. Lonnie's arms fell to his sides, and he relaxed with a suddenness that was almost comical. The white dress floated towards him, and Milligan turned and tipped his cowboy hat. He paid no attention to the foreman. The man might as well have never been there. He took a step forward. "Miss Selby, I presume," he said. "Forgive me, but it seems that, as a stranger, I must introduce myself. I am Thomas Milligan. I have just been performing the same act for your father's foreman's benefit. Can I see Mr. Selby?" He looked down into what he thought at that moment was the loveliest, saddest little face he had ever seen. It was dark from sunburn, in contrast to the pristine white uniform the girl wore, and her cheeks had a healthy flush, perhaps reflecting the rosy hue of the ribbon around her neck. But it was the calm, dark brown eyes, partly longing and entirely sorrowful, and the slight downturn at the corners of her pretty mouth that left him with a striking impression. She was a delightful sight, but one filled with profound melancholy, completely at odds with her youth and radiant beauty. She looked up at him from beneath the brim of a wide straw sun hat, adorned with a simple silk scarf, and pinned to her abundant curly brown hair to provide her face with maximum shade. Then she confidently extended her hand in greeting towards him, while her eyes inquired about his experience, for she had witnessed the interaction between the two men and overheard their conversation. However, Milligan listened to her welcome with a disarming smile on his face. "Welcome, Mr. Milligan," she said seriously. "We have been anticipating your arrival." "But I'm sorry to inform you that you cannot see my father at the moment. He is currently resting. He always takes a nap in the afternoon. You see, whether it's day or night, it doesn't make a difference to him. He is visually impaired. He has developed a peculiar habit of sleeping during the day, as well as at night. Perhaps it is a blessing that helps him forget about his affliction. As a result, I'm always careful not to wake him. But please come up to the house. You must have some lunch and later enjoy a cup of tea. You're extremely kind." Milligan observed a worried expression that appeared on her calm face. Then he observed as she turned and dismissed the embarrassed foreman. "I won't be riding this afternoon, Lonnie," she said coldly. "Instead, you can have Bessie's hooves trimmed for me. They are becoming quite long." Then she turned her attention back to her guest. "Please, Mr. Milligan." And the resident of New England willingly complied. He didn't even glance in the foreman's direction again. Lonnie cursed silently, but with such intense hatred that even his thick beard and mustache separated, revealing his cruel mouth and clenched teeth underneath. His eyes also gleamed with a devilish light. In that moment, Milligan was in control of the situation, but as Lonnie had mentioned, he was the boss of that ranch. However, being the boss didn't mean being the owner. Chapter 3. Milligan was genuinely glad to leave Lonnie Harnack in the dust, but he appeared quite solemn as he and his buddy proceeded towards the residence. He understood that the consequences of his encounter with the supervisor would catch up with him down the line, and it was wise for him to be ready. The meeting had been unfortunate, but based on what he had heard about Lonnie and Falls, he must have inevitably crossed paths with the bully sooner or later. Lonnie himself would have made sure of that. Heather Selby paused as she reached the porch. They had not spoken since their greeting. Now she turned abruptly and quietly assessed her guest. There was no rudeness in her gaze either. Milligan felt like he was undergoing a silent interrogation and waited, smiling down at her from his taller stature. Finally, she smiled up at him and nodded. "Am I suitable?" he inquired. "I believe so," she replied. It was an interesting situation, and they both laughed. However, the girl's demeanor lacked levity. "You're not sure. Is there something wrong with me? My dress, perhaps?" Milligan laughed again. He had missed the true significance of his companion's attitude towards him. For a brief moment, the dark little face displayed a look of confusion. Then the furrow in her brow smoothed out, and she answered with a demure smile. "Oh, I don't see why," hesitantly. Then more confidently, "No. You see, you're a newcomer. You'll get used to it later on." And the last barrier of formality was discarded. "Great," exclaimed Milligan emphatically. "We're going to be friends, Miss Selby. I knew it. I was just worried that they might ruin my chances of your approval. You see, they've already caused me trouble." "Yes, I think we will be friends," Heather responded calmly. "In the meantime, come inside the house and have your lunch. It's ready. I saw you coming and immediately prepared it. You won't mind if I sit and watch while you eat. I've already had mine. I want to talk to you before you meet my father." There was evident anxiety in her manner. Above all, her eyes revealed her unease. However, he showed no indication of it, contenting himself with a warm reply. "You're so kind. I'd also like to have a chat. You see, I'm a novice, and you've been generous enough to overlook my shortcomings." Heather led the way into the house, and Milligan, following her, was impressed by the cozy comfort of this home in the wilderness. It was a spacious two-story house, unpretentious, but very roomy. They entered through one of 3 large windows that seemed to serve as a multi-purpose drawing room. Beyond this, they crossed a hallway, with the entrance door wide open, and entered a dining room, which then led directly into a kitchen. This room overlooked the woods at the back. Heather explained that her father's study was in front of this, while her bedroom was behind the drawing room, opposite the dining room and kitchen. The upstairs rooms were bedrooms, including her own private sitting room. "You see, we don't employ any female servants, Mr. Milligan," the girl said, as she brought a pot of hot coffee from the kitchen and placed it on the table. "I'm the housekeeper. Joe Nelson, the handyman, is my assistant and handles all the heavy work. He's quite a character." "Yes, I know. I've met him," remarked Milligan dryly. Try that ham. I'm not sure about the cold pie. It might be tough. Yes, old Joe is originally from England. Well, he used to be, but he's fully adapted to America now. He spent 40 years in Texas. He's actually an educated man. Owned a nice ranch, and it got destroyed in a fire. I'm very fond of him, but it's not Joe I want to talk about." "No." The man helped himself to the ham and veal pie, and found it to be anything but tough. Heather seated herself in a chair with her back to the uncovered window, where the early summer sun was shining through. "You've met Lonnie Harnack, and you've made an enemy out of him," she suddenly said, with straightforwardness. "Yes, the latter must have come anyway." The girl sighed, and her eyes sparkled with a contemplative glow. And Milligan, glancing at her, recognized the sadness of expression he had noticed at their first meeting, and which, he was soon to learn, was habitual to her. "I suppose so," she murmured in response. Then she snapped back into focus and spoke with a hint of sharpness. "What would you have done if he had hit you? He is a man of enormous strength." Milligan laughed casually. "That depends. I'm not quite sure. I would probably have done my best to retaliate. I had another option. I might have shot him." "Oh!" the girl exclaimed with impulsive horror. "Well, what else could you have done?" Milligan raised his eyebrows and turned his astonished gaze towards her. Was I supposed to stand passively and accept a beating from that despicable brute? No, no, he shook his head. I see it in your eyes. You disapprove of the method, but not the man. Remember, we all have a right to survive if we can. Maybe it's not absolutely necessary, but we are still allowed to give it our best shot. That's the philosophy I've had drilled into me by the various beatings bullies from my hometown have occasionally administered. I definitely would have given it my all. And if you had done either of these things, I shudder to think what would have happened. It was unfortunate, terribly unfortunate. You don't know Lonnie Harnack. Oh, Mr. Milligan, the girl rushed on, leaning suddenly forward in her chair and reaching out until her small brown hand rested on his arm. Please, please promise me that you won't cross paths with Lonnie. He is terrifying. You can't know him, or you would understand the danger you're in. On the contrary, Miss Selby, it is because I know a great deal about him that I would be prepared to retaliate very forcefully. I thank my lucky stars that I do know him. If I hadn't known about him previously, your own words would have alerted me to be prepared for any unforeseen circumstances. Lonnie has to go his own way and I'll go mine. I'm here to learn about ranching, not to succumb to any forceful tactics. But let's put Lonnie aside for now and discuss something more enjoyable. What an enchanting situation the ranch has. The girl reclined in her chair. There was no doubting the determination conveyed in her visitor's words. She sensed that no amount of persuasion on her part could change his mind. Making an effort, she managed to respond. Yes, it's a beautiful spot. You haven't had enough time yet to appreciate the perfection of our surroundings. She paused, expecting him to say something, but as he remained silent, she continued with her thoughts fixed on other matters. The foothills extend almost to our very doorstep, and beyond them in the distance are the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. We are protected, as you may have already observed, by the nearly impassable barrier beyond the river, and the pine forests shield us from the harsh winter winds blowing from the northeast and north. To the south and east, there are miles and miles of prairie lands. Father has been here for 18 years. I was only 4 years old when we arrived. Whitewater was just a small settlement back then, and Falls didn't even exist. In those days, our nearest neighbor was Whitewater, apart from the Indians and mixed-race individuals. It was a difficult period, and my father managed to maintain his position through his cleverness, despite his limited vision, and with the help of the men he had with him. Lonnie has been with us for as long as I can remember. So you see, she added, returning to her feminine concern for his safety, I know Lonnie. My warning isn't a baseless fear from a foolish girl. Milligan remained silent for a moment or two. Then he asked abruptly, Why does your father keep him? The girl shrugged her shoulders. Lonnie is the best rancher in the country. And in the silence that followed, Milligan helped himself to more coffee and finished with cheese and crackers. Neither seemed inclined to break the awkwardness of the pause. At the moment, the man's thoughts were wandering, speculating on the possibilities of his future on the ranch. He wasn't thinking so much about Lonnie or even William Selby. It was the more gentle connections with the girl next to him, connections he had never expected in his wildest dreams. She wasn't a girl raised on the prairie. Her way of speaking, her manner, had too much of a civilized flavor. Yes, he concluded in his mind, even though she claimed Fly Bend as her home since the age of 4, she had been educated elsewhere. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted. A faint sound caught his sharp ears. Then Heather's voice, questioning him, brought his wandering attention back. I heard you plan to stay with us for 3 years? Just as long as it takes to learn all about ranching, he replied quickly. I'm going to become one of the... Once again, he heard the peculiar noise and paused to listen. Heather was listening too. It was a soft tap, tap, like someone gently knocking on a covered door. It was irregular, intermittent, like the slow tapping of a telegraph receiver. What's that? He asked. The girl had stood up, a puzzled expression in her eyes. The noise? Oh, it's my father, she whispered, with a faint smile and a hushed tone. Something must have disturbed him. It's unusual for him to be awake so early. They heard a door open, and the tapping ceased. Then the door closed, and the lock turned. A moment later, the sound of keys jingling and shuffling footsteps accompanied the resumed tapping. Milligan continued to listen. He had turned towards the door, and while his attention was fixed on the arrival of the blind rancher, he was yet aware that Heather was clearing the table with what seemed to him unnecessary speed and noise. However, His momentary interest was focused on the doorway and the hallway outside, and he paid little attention to the girl's movements. The door stood open, and as he looked out, the sound of shuffling feet drew closer. Then a figure passed by quickly. It disappeared in an instant, but in that instant he caught a glimpse of a tall man wrapped in a gray robe that reached down to his feet. That, and the sharp outline of a large head of closely cropped gray hair. The face was obscured, except for the side view. He saw a long, high-bridged nose and a short, crisp, grayish beard. The tapping of the cane slowly diminished, and he knew that the blind man had gone out onto the porch. Now he turned his attention back to the girl and would have spoken, but she raised a warning finger and shook her head. Then, moving towards the door, she motioned for him to follow. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. "Father, this is Mr. Milligan." Milligan found himself looking down at an extraordinary face. He acknowledged Heather's introduction, momentarily forgetting about the man's sightless eyes. He warmly shook the outstretched hand, while forming his initial impression of a peculiar personality. They were now on the porch. The rancher was seated in a prim, unupholstered armchair. He had a strong, well-shaped, pale face, with eyes that held one's attention despite their lack of sight. Milligan immediately understood Chuck's description of them. They were unsettling eyes. The pupils were present, and to some extent, looked normal except for their tremendous size. They were jet black and were separated from what should have been the whites by tiny rings of blue, the only hint of an iris they possessed. But it was the whites that gave them their terrible expression. They were red with inflammation, an inflammation that extended to the edges of the eyelids and had eroded the lashes. As for the rest of the face, he couldn't form much of an opinion. The gray eyebrows were lowered as if in physical pain, completely erasing any natural expression, and the beard concealed any clues that the mouth and chin might have provided. "Welcome, Mr. Milligan," he said in a soft, gentle tone. "I knew you were here a while ago." Milligan was surprised by the calm refinement of his voice. He had become so accustomed to the loud, harsh accent of the men in these wildernesses that it caught him off guard. "I hope I didn't disturb you," he replied cheerfully. "Miss Selby told me you were sleeping, and—" "You didn't disturb me, at least not in the way you mean. You see, I have developed a strange sensitivity, a kind of second sight," he chuckled bitterly. "I woke up by instinct the moment you approached the house and heard you come in. The loss of one sense, you see, has sharpened the others. Well, well, so you've come to learn about ranching? Heather," the blind man turned to his daughter, "describe Mr. Milligan to me. What does he look like? Forgive me, my dear sir," he continued, turning with unerring instinct to the other. "I gain a perfect understanding of those around me in this manner." "Certainly." The blind man's object of interest smiled at the girl. Heather hesitated, feeling a bit flustered. "Go on, child," her father said, slightly impatient. Encouraged, she began, "Mr. Milligan is tall, 6 feet, broad-shouldered." The man's red, staring eyes remained fixed on his pupil with unwavering intensity. "Yes, yes," he urged as the girl paused. "Dressed in her fashionable riding outfit." His face? Black hair, steel blue eyes, black eyelashes and eyebrows, wide forehead. "Any wrinkles?" questioned the blind man. "Only 2 prominent lines between the eyebrows. Go on." Broad-bridged, quite large nose, well-shaped mouth with a tendency to droop at the corners, wide, split chin, well-rounded cheeks and jaw. "Ha! Clean-shaven, of course, yes." The rancher sat silent for some moments after Heather had finished her description. His lips moved, as if he were talking to himself, but no words came out. At last he stirred and snapped out of his daydream. "You come from Springfield, Mr. Milligan, I understand?" he said pleasantly. "Yes." New England. A good country that produces good men." He nodded with an expression that was almost a smile. "I'm glad to be able to welcome you. I only wish I could see. However," he continued kindly, "you will be able to learn ranching in all its aspects here. We breed horses and cattle. You'll find it challenging. My foreman is not exactly gentle, but believe me, he knows his business. He is the best rancher in the country, and I owe much of my success to him. You must get on his good side, though. It takes some effort, I mean, but it is worth pursuing." Milligan smiled as he listened. He wholeheartedly agreed with the mention of the difficulty in finding Lonnie's good side. He tried to make eye contact with Heather, but she avoided his gaze. As the rancher paused, he immediately interrupted. "I assume I start working seriously tomorrow morning?" The blind man shook his head. "No, it's better to start today. Our agreement specifies today. It must not be broken. You'll take your position as one of the workers, and will be under the supervision of Lonnie Harnack. We can have tea first, though," added Heather, who had followed her father's words very closely. "Tut, tut, child," he replied impatiently. "Yes, we will have tea. That's all you think about. Take care of it, and bring Milligan a chair. I need to talk to him." His words were a dismissal, and after Heather had provided a chair, she went inside, leaving apprentice and master alone, and the two men talked, as men do when they have just come together from opposite ends of the world. Milligan avoided discussing the details of his journey, and the blind man didn't seem interested in his personal matters. They discussed news about people and things concerning the world. The rancher's information, remarks, and sharp, insightful questions intrigued the newcomer. He observed the face in front of him, the red, sightless eyes. He studied the calm, soft-spoken man, like one would study a complex problem. The outcome was disheartening. He only saw a prolonged, weary expression of pain, no variations of emotion and interest. It was the face of someone who had grown patient throughout a lifetime of suffering. Milligan had heard people curse this man, but as he listened to the gentle voice and sophisticated expressions, the articulate criticisms on public matters, the broad philosophy with a hint of bitterness and cynicism, yet always sensible, he found it difficult to connect him with the notable reputation of the ranch. Tea time arrived, and he still grappled with the unresolved puzzle. However, when Heather appeared with the table and a loaded tray, he put it aside for future contemplation. For the next half hour, he focused on the relationship between father and daughter, as they conversed pleasantly about the ranching prospects of the area for the visitors' benefit. This was a smaller mystery, and one he almost solved. Before he left, he concluded that Heather held great reverence, if not fear, for her father. This surprised him, considering the strength of character evident in every aspect of her face. It appeared to him that she was making a great effort to show affection towards him, attempting to create a feeling that did not truly exist in her heart. Her attempts were painfully obvious. She immediately convinced him of a strong sense of responsibility, a sense she was taking to an extent that was almost pitiful. He was certain of all this, but it was the man who ultimately confused him, just as he had done in the past. How he felt about Heather was impossible to determine. Sometimes he could have sworn that the man's devotion to her was that of someone who clings to a support that never fails him, even in helplessness. At other times, he treated her with a sneering intolerance that angered the young man, and then he would change his tone until the underlying feeling of absolute hatred overwhelmed the polite courtesy that covered it. When he finally got up to leave the porch and find the supervisor to report for duty, he felt genuinely relieved to be away from the presence of those terrifying red eyes. Heather was packing up the tea things, and Milligan still lingered on the porch. He watched as the blind man tapped his way into the house. Then, as he disappeared and the sound of his shuffling feet grew faint and distant, he realized that Heather was standing there, holding the tray and watching him. He also knew, by her attentive posture, that she was listening to determine when her father would be out of earshot. As the sounds faded and the house became silent, she approached him. She spoke without stopping, as if afraid of being observed. "Remember, Mr. Milligan, what I warned you about Lonnie. Be cautious. Despite your assertions, you are not acquainted with him." "Thanks, Miss Selby," he responded warmly. "I won't forget." Heather was about to speak again, but her father's harsh and loud voice reached them from the hallway. "Come inside, child, and let Milligan get to work." And Milligan noticed the look of fear that quickly appeared on the girl's face as she hastily entered the house. He stood there, filled with anger and curiosity. Then he walked away towards the animal enclosures, pondering over the strange events that had unfolded one after another. "Oh, my goodness," he muttered. "This is a strange place with strange people." Just then, he saw the tall figure of Lonnie approaching him from the small, isolated hut. He walked towards him, unconsciously squaring his shoulders as he neared. He anticipated an outburst, or at the very least an angry display. But nothing of the sort occurred. The man's entire demeanor had changed to one of deliberate friendliness. Not only that, but his speech was meticulous, as if he was trying to impress this man from the east with his superiority over the other ranchers. "Well, have you met him?" "Yes. I have now come to inform you that I am ready to work," Milligan promptly replied. He adopted a cold and professional tone, believing it to be the best approach. To his surprise, Lonnie became almost welcoming. "Good. We could use some help, that's for sure. Did you have a pleasant conversation with the old man?" The question was asked casually, but Lonnie gave him a sideways glance as he turned away and gazed out at the distant prairie. "I did," Milligan replied curtly. "What are my instructions, and where will I be sleeping?" "So, you won't be staying in the house?" Lonnie asked, feigning surprise. There was a slight hint of acidity in his tone. "That's hardly to be expected when the supervisor sleeps down there," Milligan nodded, gesturing towards the buildings. "That's true," the other person observed thoughtfully. "No, I guess the old man doesn't like people like you around," he continued, slipping back into the bunkhouse language without caution. "Maybe it's different with the others." Milligan wanted to strike him when he saw the smug smile that accompanied the man's words. "Where will I sleep?" he demanded sharply. "Oh, I think you'll stay in the bunkhouse. The boys will probably give you blankets until your truck arrives. As for instructions, well, we start work at sunrise, and Slushy serves breakfast before that. I suppose I'll put you to work in the morning. You can't do much yet, but maybe you'll learn." "Then I'm not needed tonight?" "I guess not," Lonnie interrupted. Then he turned abruptly and faced Milligan. "I have one thing to tell you before you start," he continued. "We tolerate newcomers around here once. After that, we handle things differently, understand? There are no social gatherings customary in this place." Milligan smiled, even if he had to die for it. In that last comment, Lonnie had revealed his true intentions. Lonnie noticed the smile, and his face darkened with quick anger. But he had evidently decided not to be provoked because he abruptly walked away, leaving Milligan to make his way to the bunkhouse. The men had not yet returned for their evening meal, but Milligan found Arizona sitting disconsolately on a bundle of blankets just outside the quarters. He was chewing steadily, with his face turned towards the prairie, gazing out over the golden plains as if nothing else in the world mattered to him. He glanced up casually as Milligan approached, and shifted the blankets to make space, simply saying, "Hey." The two men sat in silence for a few moments. The pale-faced cowboy seemed lost in deep thought. Milligan was also deep in thought. He was thinking about Lonnie, who he knew was in love with his boss's daughter. It was obvious to even the most clueless person. Not only that, but he believed Heather knew it too. The way the foreman had stopped his violent attack on himself when she arrived was enough evidence, along with the jealousy he had shown when talking about tea parties. Now Milligan also understood that Lonnie's irrational jealousy had been triggered because the blind man was asleep, and if Milligan went up to the house, he would only see Heather and probably have a pleasant afternoon with her until her father woke up. He was glad to have learned these things so quickly. All these details would be useful. Finally, Arizona turned away from his emotionless contemplation of the prairie. "Well," he asked, conveying a lot of questions in that one word. "Lonnie says I start working tomorrow. Tonight I'll sleep in the bunkhouse." "Yeah, I know." "You know?" Milligan looked around in surprise. "Guess Lonnie's been here for a while. Hey, I'll shoot that guy unless someone steps in and takes care of him first." "What's going on? Anything new?" In response, Arizona spat forcefully into the small pool of tobacco juice on the ground in front of him. Then, with a tight clenching of his teeth, he said, "He's a jerk." "Which is an insult to pigs," the other person remarked with a smile. "Insult?" Arizona cried, his wild eyes rolling and his nostrils flaring as he struggled to catch his breath. "Yeah, go ahead and laugh. Laugh like a blazing 6-foot ape. Maybe you'll change that grin later when I tell you what he's done. Nothing he could do would surprise me after having met him." "No." Arizona had calmed again. His explosive nature was a study. Milligan, although he had only just met this man, liked him for his very wildness. "Say, partner," he went on quietly, reaching one long, lean hand toward him. "Shake. I guess I owe you gratitude for bluffing that pig. We see it all. Say, you've got courage." And the fierce eyes looked into the other's face. Milligan shook the offered hand heartily. "But what's his latest achievement?" he asked, eager to learn the fresh development. "He came along here about you. Said we were to fix you up in poor Dave Steele's bunk." "Yes, that's good. I rather expected he'd have me sleep on the floor." Arizona gave a snort. His anger was rising again, but he checked it. "Say," he continued, "guess you don't know a lot. There hasn't been a fellow slept in that bunk since Dave went away." "Why?" Milligan's interest was piqued. "Why?" Arizona's voice rose. "'Cause it's messed all up with a crazy man's blood. A crazy man who was killed right here, sort of, by Lonnie Harnack." "I heard something of it." "Heard something of it? Well, I guess there isn't a fellow around this prairie who hasn't shouted himself hoarse about Dave. Say, he was the most harmless lad who ever jerked a rope or slung a leg over a stock saddle. And as skilled a hand as there ever was around this ranch. I tell you, he could teach every one of us, he was that handy. And that's a long journey, I admit. Well, we were rounding up a bunch of outlaws for branding, and he was about to rope an old bull. However, he got him kind of awkwardly. The rope got caught on the fellow's horns. Before Dave could release it, that bull got angry and charged straight for the corral walls and broke a couple of the bars. Dave jumped for it and got away. Then Lonnie comes yelling and swearing like crazy, and Dave took it badly. You see, no one could handle an outlaw like Dave. He retaliated and cursed back at Lonnie. What does Lonnie do but grab a branding iron and hit the boy on the head? Dave just dropped right then and there. Then we gathered around, lifted him up, and laid him in his bed, bleeding terribly. We tended to his wounds and cared for him, and after some time, he regained consciousness. He stayed in bed on his back for a month, and there was no sign of Lonnie or the blind man, only Miss Diane. She came, and we did everything we could. But after a month, he started acting crazy and foolish. He died there in Falls soon after. Arizona paused with significance. Then he continued, "No, sir, no one has been put in that bed since, because they never got poor Dave's blood off of it. You know, there's nothing that would scare us cowboys, but we won't sleep over a bed stained with a crazy man's blood. Which apparently I have to do," Milligan said sharply. Then he asked, "Is it the only available bed?" "No, there's Thompson's, and there's Massey's." "Then what's the purpose?" "Malice. It's a kind of spiteful attention. It's meant to get back at you, knowing that we cowboys would surely tell you about Dave. It's a way of hinting to you what happens to those who cross him, what is likely to happen to you." Arizona's fists clenched, and his teeth gritted with anger as he deduced the situation. Milligan remained calm, but he appreciated listening to the passionate cowpuncher, and he felt a warmth towards him. "I'm afraid I will have to disappoint him," he said, once the other had finished. "If you guys could lend me some blankets, I'll crash in Massey's or Thompson's bunk, and Mr. Lonnie can go do his own thing." Arizona glanced around and studied Milligan's face. "And you'll definitely do that?" "Absolutely. I'm not going to sleep in a nasty bunk. Hey, you're the most peculiar greenhorn I've ever seen. Let's shake on it." Once again the two men shook hands. That first evening in the bunkhouse, Milligan learned a lot about his new home and also the most skillful way to swear at the flies. He had dinner with the guys, and his meal consisted of hash, tea, and dry bread. It was tough but nutritious, and there was plenty of it. His new companions shared their stories with him, around him, and directed at him. He listened to their banter, rowdy and unsophisticated, their intense bursts of anger and easy friendships. They seemed to have no worries in the world except for the current annoyances. Even their animosity towards the supervisor and their employer seemed to fade away as they showered them with curses. It was a new life, a new world for him, and a life that appealed to him. As the sun set and the twilight faded, the men gradually went off to sleep. Arizona was the last one to leave. Milligan had been shown Massey's bunk, and kind hands had prepared it for him with blankets. He stood at the end of the bunk in the long aisle between the two rows of beds. Arizona had just pointed out the unused couch of the deceased, covered in gunny sacks. "That's Dave's," he said. I think you'll sleep better here. Listen, Milligan, he continued, with a serious look in his eyes. I just want to say one thing to you, as someone experienced around these parts, and that is this. When you start feeling anxious, use your gun. It's easy and quick. You probably have plenty of time to spare after assessing the situation. There isn't a person big enough in this world to do anything if you refuse and have your gun pointed at them. Goodbye. But Milligan stopped him. Just a moment, Arizona, he said, imitating the other person's impressive manner. I just want to say one thing to you, since I'm also new around here, and that's this. Since you're about my size, I wonder if you could sell me a pair of pants like the ones you guys usually wear. The cowboy smiled a pale, shadowy smile and went over to his bag. He returned a moment later with a pair of new, thick trousers and threw them on the bed. You can have them, I suppose. A little something to remember for speaking honestly to Lonnie. Say, that really made me feel better. Thanks, but I'll pay. No way, sir. Then I'll remember your advice. Goodbye. Chapter 4. Milligan had no desire to sleep whatsoever. He was physically exhausted, but his mind was still racing. Besides, the bunkhouse didn't appeal to him yet. The 2 rows of bunk beds with their untidy occupants were anything but pleasant sleeping companions. The air was stuffy, and the dim yellow light from the 2 oil lamps, one at each end of the room, made the place seem unpleasantly dirty. He wasn't overly sensitive, far from it, but it's important to note that he had just come from a world of comfort and luxury, where crisp white sheets and stylish surroundings were essential. So these things came as a shock to him. He glanced at his blankets spread over the straw mattress that covered the loose bedboards underneath, and this drew his attention to the mattress itself. It was worn out and dusty, and as he shifted it, he could feel the straw inside crushed into tiny pieces. He carefully placed it back, making sure not to disturb the dust, and rearranged the blankets over it. Then he sat at the end of the bed and contemplated. He looked around at the other beds. Some of the men were already sleeping, making more or less noise. Others were wrapped in their blankets, smoking in solemn silence. One was engrossed in the thrilling pages of a cheap novel, straining his eyes in the flickering light of the lamps. The scene was new to him, but not entirely captivating, so he filled his pipe, lit it, and went outside into the fresh night air. It was only 10 o'clock, and he thought that a smoke and some peaceful reflection would be enjoyable before settling onto his dusty mattress. The moon hadn't risen yet, but the starry sky faintly outlined everything. He was gazing at the serene sight of a ranch when night had fully embraced it. There were few sounds to distract his thoughts. The air buzzed with the activity of insects. Occasionally one of the ranch dogs would bark, its fiercely suspicious temperament likely stirred by some vague shadow that only his eyes could possibly detect in the darkness. Sometimes, the sorrowful cry of a hungry coyote, forever searching for something it never seems to find as it constantly prowls and hunts, would break the silence and startle the inexperienced person with the suddenness and proximity of its eerie call. But otherwise, everything was quiet, and he paced back and forth in front of the bunkhouse, deep in thought. Strangely enough, of all the scenes he had witnessed that day and all the people he had encountered, it was the scene involving Heather Selby that occupied his mind the most. Perhaps it was the unexpectedness of meeting such a delightful girl that kept him intrigued. Perhaps it was her intense desire she had shown in warning him of his personal danger. Maybe, even, it was the memory of the gentle brown eyes, the charming little sun-kissed face that had first looked up at him from under the wide-brimmed straw hat. Certainly, her sorrowful expression haunted him like no other woman's face had ever haunted him before as he gazed upon the vast, dim world around him. He felt a yearning to learn something about her story, not out of idle curiosity, but in the hopes of finding a way to erase the sadness that seemed out of place on her beautiful features. His pipe extinguished, he refilled and relit it. Then he continued his wanderings. He moved away from the deeper shadows of the bunkhouse and turned the corner towards the western group of enclosures. Now he spotted the foreman's cabin beyond the dark outline of the large storage shed, with a light still shining in the window. Turning away, he passed to the left of the shed, leisurely strolling towards the enclosures. He had no desire whatsoever to encounter Lonnie Harnack. Not that he believed it was likely, but there was always a chance if the man had not yet retired for the night. He had already concluded that it would be best for both of them to have as little interaction as possible. He remained seated on top of the enclosure fence for a few minutes, but the flies were too bothersome, forcing him to continue wandering. Just as he was about to move on, he witnessed the door of the foreman's cabin open, and in the light emanating from within, the small figure of the worker, Joe Nelson, emerged. Then the light disappeared as Lonnie, the imposing figure, blocked the doorway. Now he distinctly heard their conversation. "I'll need it first thing in the morning," said the supervisor in his deep, rough voice. "I'll take care of it," Joe replied, "but it's not suitable for just anyone to use." "That doesn't matter. Your job is to have it there." Then Lonnie left, and the door was closed. A moment later, the man waiting saw Joe come out from the shadow and walk off towards the bunkhouse. A few yards away from the supervisor's cabin, he stopped and turned around. Then Milligan witnessed something that made him smile and filled his heart with satisfaction. Joe slowly raised his arm towards the cabin, and even though it was too dark to see, and no words were audible, he was certain that Joe's fist was clenched and a string of profanity polluted the night air. A moment later, Joe continued on his way, and the light in Lonnie's home went out. Now, without paying attention to his direction, Milligan continued walking. He headed towards an open shed filled with wagons.